everyone can hear me. Welcome everyone to this month's session of the Everyday Environment webinar series. And today we're going to be talking about composting, and I'm guessing that a lot of you already compost, and you probably have done it for a number of years, and that's good, that's great. And you're probably just wanting maybe a little refresher, or maybe try to learn a little bit more about composting. So that's all good. And then we may have some folks that haven't composted before, and that's fine, that's great too. So we're going to go through, we're going to talk a little bit about the composting process. We're going to talk about things that work well in compost, things that don't work well in compost. And then we're going to should have quite a bit of time at the end for questions, because for this presentation, there seems like there's usually quite a few questions. People have specific things that they want to talk about, so that's fine. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is aerobic composting. There's a number of different types of composting, and in fact, next month, our host, Peggy Doty, is going to be talking about vermicomposting. So, but what we're going to be dealing with in today's session is aerobic composting, and what that means is we're going to be using little critters, bacteria, essentially, as the worker bees for decomposing organic material. And the reason we call it aerobic composting is because they need oxygen to work. And we're going to be talking about that this afternoon. Now, the reason that we talk about this, if you want the best results, if you want a really good quality compost, then you should manage it. I know a lot of folks just put a bunch of stuff out there and let nature do its thing, and that's perfectly fine. But the product you may get may not be exactly what you were hoping for when everything is said and done. So if you can manage that process, one of the things that'll happen is you'll get an end product sooner. And if it's properly managed, you'll get also a much better end product. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about for today's presentation. Okay, and we've kind of already talked about why compost. Now, the thing that happens is the same thing that would happen as if you take that material and you just take it out, dig a trench, bury it. Those microorganisms are still going to do their thing. Nature's still going to do its thing. But what we're trying to do again is we're trying to get a relatively stable form of organic matter that if you use it, for example, as a soil amendment, you shouldn't have problems with any plants turning yellow if you plant into that material because of a nitrogen deficiency. There's also a lot of other benefits for it in terms of disease suppression. And again, what we're doing is we're adding organic matter to the soil. The more organic matter that's in a soil, the more productive that soil is going to be. It's also going to be looser. It's going to allow water to be retained in that soil, especially the coarser soils you have, the better that soil is going to be in terms of retaining soil moisture in the root zone. On the other end of the scale, if you've got a very clayey soil, a very heavy soil, and you can add organic matter to it, that's going to help provide some additional structure that will allow that soil to open up some, so it will allow water to move through it more readily and allow roots to move through it more readily. Some of the other benefits, because it is organic matter, it's going to attract earthworms. And we all know the benefits of earthworms. The one thing I do want to mention, though, with compost is don't think of it really as a fertilizer. It will provide some nutrients, but in terms of an analysis for fertilizer, and in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, you may be talking about an analysis of maybe a 222 or a 555. It's not going to be like the lawn fertilizer you get at the retail store. So don't think of it in that way. It will provide nutrients, but not a lot of them. One of the other benefits for a well-managed compost, when you get that good finished end product, is the organisms that are still in there will have been shown to suppress certain types of diseases, especially certain types of root fungal diseases. So a number of different benefits for doing that composting. In terms of the whole composting process, there are things that go into it, and then we have things that come out of it. For the microorganisms, again, we're mainly talking about bacteria. Those bacteria need oxygen and they need water. if they have both of those things, they are going to work on those organic materials. And basically, almost any type of organic material can be decomposed. We're going to focus on just some that work very well. As that decomposition is taking place, you get some byproducts. You get some of that water drawn off and put into the air as water vapor. As those microorganisms proliferate and generate, their metabolism generates heat. And that's where the heat comes from, is just from the metabolism of all of those bacteria that's in that compost. It's also going to take some of the carbon in that organic material and drive it off into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. What you hopefully have left at the end of the whole thing is a fairly stable form of organic matter. Now, there's very wide ranges of organic matter in terms of its stability. When you have fresh organic matter, that stuff is not considered stable. It's not something that will hang around for a long time. Stable organic matter is something that is much harder to break down and will stay in the soil for a much longer period of time. So let's talk a little bit about what type of organisms are needed for this. And where do they come from? Well, basically, they're already all out there. If you have any soil in that compost, leaves, food scraps, manure, or even finished compost, you've got the microorganisms already in there. And in terms of additives and those types of things, we're not going to focus a whole lot on additives in this presentation. But if you have the basics of what we're going to talk about today in that compost pile, you don't need to add any additives whatsoever. Nature will take care of itself and it will do its own thing. What we are looking at, the worker bees for this whole process, is aerobic bacteria. They are bacteria that only work in the presence of oxygen, but they're very good at what they do and they can break that material down very quickly. The reason they're going to be there is because of two things that are in that organic material: carbon and nitrogen. They're going to use that carbon as their energy source. They're going to use the nitrogen to build protein. That's what's going to help build the cell walls of that bacteria. So you've got those things there. That's why they're there, and they're going to make use of both of those things. As like any other type of bacteria in nature, we have no idea how many trillions and quadrillions and quintillions of bacteria are out there in the world. It's everywhere. Even in 1 gram of compost, so about a teaspoon, you could have over 1 billion aerobic bacteria present. And the thing is, as they're working and they have generated that heat, all the other types of microorganisms that you may think are in there aren't. So things like the insects, things like the fungi, those types of things are not going to be present to any great extent because they can't stand the heat. So they've gotten out of the kitchen. So they're not going to be present until that heat process is finished. And then at that stage, once that compost cools down, then those other critters will come in and help start to decompose some of that harder to decompose organic material. Just like other things in nature, composting goes through a seasonality. Now, right now, this time of year, we've already had our first frost throughout most of the state. So it hasn't shut down completely, but it's beginning to wind down. Now, depending on what type of winter we have, and the long-term forecast for the winter is actually calling for above normal temperatures. So if we have near or above normal temperatures through most of the state, there still may be a little bit of that composting going on inside the very center of most compost piles. But if we get a really good cold snap, it's pretty well going to shut down. That's okay though, because come springtime, when those temperatures warm up, nature will allow that bacteria to fire back up again and it will start decomposing again. As the temperature and moisture levels are ideal, we usually have a peak somewhere in the early to midsummer. During later on in the summer, things usually dry out in most cases. So that's where that downtrend comes along. And then we get that little bump right before the first frost, as we still have really good temperatures and maybe we've gotten a little bump in moisture. But you'll see that seasonality happen year in and year out. Now, if we don't have aerobic bacteria in that compost, nature has a backup plan. And this type of bacteria has been around for billions of years longer than aerobic bacteria because for billions of years, Earth did not have oxygen in its atmosphere. But these other type of bacteria were around and they're called anaerobic bacteria. So they will work. They will try to break down that organic material, but they're not very good at it. They're not very efficient. And they produce a lot of byproducts that people don't really like to be around. Organic acids, the amines, that hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell will be present. And then these last two, cadaverine and putrescine, as you might expect, don't smell very good. So when you have a compost pile and you're starting to get that rotten egg smell or some type of really bad odor with it, that's a really good indication that the majority of that oxygen has gone out of that compost. So let's talk about some of the things that go into that composting process that you really do need for that compost to work well. So let's talk about the food factor. Again, that organic material is providing that carbon and nitrogen for microorganisms. And typically, when we look at a lot of compost piles, it's nitrogen that's going to be the limiting factor. We have all the carbon we need in most cases, but nitrogen a lot of times is very low. And the reason for that is because of this carbon nitrogen ratio. Every type of organic matter has carbon and has nitrogen in it. It's always going to have more carbon, but that ratio can vary very widely. And typically, we call them the greens and the browns. Any type of brown material or things that we think of as dead material has huge amounts of carbon, but not much nitrogen. That nitrogen has gone away and gone into the atmosphere. On the other hand, fresh material, things that are living or maybe have just been picked, for example, still have quite a bit of nitrogen in it. So, what we have to do in most cases, well, first of all, let me talk about this. So, the brown material, again, high carbon material, things like wood shavings, wood chips, sawdust, brown leaves. Brown materials, very high carbon content. We can also talk about newspaper, black and white newsprint, especially, and then even colored newsprint with soy based ink, high carbon sources, still good composting material. And then on the other side, fresh fruit scraps, vegetable scraps, tea grounds, coffee grounds, lots of nitrogen in that material. So typically, what we have to do is we have to put several materials together. And what we're looking for is all of these materials, and depending on how much of each material you put in, you're hopefully getting to the point where that average of carbon nitrogen ratios averages out somewhere around 25 to 1. That's about the ideal carbon nitrogen ratio for really good rapid composting. So typically to do that, you have to have at least a fourth to a half of the volume of that compost be in a high nitrogen category. So now you're asking, well, how do you know which materials are high nitrogen? Well, that's a good question because that's what I'm going to tell you next. Here's some examples, and these numbers are not fast and hard. They're just to kind of give you a guideline. But for food waste, things like that vegetable or fruit scraps, around 15 to 1. That's supplying a lot of nitrogen. Anything below 25 to 1 is going to be a high nitrogen source. Fresh grass clippings, not the brown stuff, but if you've just mowed the lawn and you've got a bunch of grass clippings that you picked up, great composting source if it hasn't been sprayed. That's around 20 to 1. Cow manure, 20 to 1. Horse manure. Now, if you look at that number, you'd say, well, you could probably just use horse manure by itself. But if anybody has horses or has been around horses, you know that you almost never get just horse manure by itself. And with a lot of manures, if it's picked up out of a barn, you're going to get a lot of bedding associated with it. So that carbon nitrogen ratio is going to be a lot different in that type of material because you've already picked up a lot of high carbon stuff in there with it. So typically you may still have to blend that with something else. Coffee grounds, tea grounds, very high nitrogen, around 20 to 1 carbon nitrogen ratio. Legume hay. Now we're not talking about straw. We're talking about things like alfalfa or clover hay, 20 to 1. Dried blood, extremely high nitrogen source. Chicken manure, sheep manure, rabbit manure, all great composting materials, but You do not want to use dog or cat waste. And why not? Because they have different digestive systems. They are carnivores. These other critters are herbivores. And so you do not want to use dog or cat waste in there because they can put in pathogens that can remain in that compost. Okay, on the other side, things with a high carbon value, those brown leaves around 80 to 1, straw around 80 to 1. Sawdust can really vary widely. If you got fresh sawdust right from the sawmill, it may be upwards of 700 to 1. On the other hand, if you got sawdust that's been sitting around for 10 or 15 years, it may be down to 200 to 1. Paper around 200 to 1. And again, a lot of this depends on what type of material you have available. Corn stalks 70 to 1, and then bark anywhere from 200 to 500 to 1, and and then the softwood around 5 to 600 to 1. So quite a bit of very high carbon material there. You're not going to be able to compost that material by itself. You're going to have to blend it. The other thing you do not want to add to a compost pile: bones, oils, fats, or greases, and meat or dairy. And why is that? A couple of reasons. When you add that oily, fatty, greasy material, for example, you're shutting down air pathways. And remember, we want to have a lot of air, a lot of oxygen in that compost for those microbes to work. So in those cases, when those avenues for air movement are shut down, it will go anaerobic very quickly. You don't want to add the meat, the dairy, or the bones, because if you do, you're going to invite every little critter in the neighborhood to come check things out. Now, I guess if you don't really want to turn the compost yourself, you could kind of bury a bone in there and then let your friendly neighborhood skunk or raccoon come in there and turn the thing for you. But otherwise, better to leave those things out. For the air factor, we've already talked about this, but the aerobic bacteria have to have oxygen to work and for that compost to compost quickly. That's going to be affected by a number of different things. It can be affected by wind, for example. And wind, you might think, well, if it's windy, that's going to add a lot of air movement through there. It will, but then on the other side, it will take out moisture. And you also have to have water, a certain amount of water in there, because we'll find out here, and I think just another slide or two, that if you don't have any moisture, you don't have much oxygen that the bacteria can use either. And if you get it too wet, then you're cutting down on the air spaces as well. Porosity: how big are those air spaces? Is that air able to move through that compost? Or do you have pockets where at least you can have a sizable amount of oxygen in those particular areas? We probably all know that the atmosphere has a 21% oxygen in it. Compost is not going to have 21% oxygen in it. And I really doubt that anybody is going to go out and pay a couple $1,000s for an oxygen probe. Now, you can use the inverse of that. You can go out and measure the amount of carbon dioxide, but even those probes cost hundreds of dollars. So I don't think a backyard composter is going to use those things. Commercial composters will, but um, just know that that oxygen can get down fairly low before you start having problems. But um, again, if you have even large spaces in there and you think, well, I've got a lot of coarse material in there, I've got lots of air pockets, if it goes even below 10%, that compost can still become anaerobic. And what that means is you're not going to get a good end product, and it's going to take much longer for things to decompose. So again, with this oxygen, and this is where I'm talking about, was going to talk about the moisture. Oxygen has to dissolve in the water films around those particles for the microbes to use. And so if you have a very dry compost, you're not going to have those water films in there. So no water, no oxygen, no aerobic bacteria. The higher that compost temperature gets, and we do want that compost to heat up to a certain extent, but just know that the higher the temperatures means that there's going to be less oxygen available because some of that is going to evaporate and be driven off as water vapor. But then also, the warmer water gets, the less oxygen it can hold. What we do not want to get over in terms of temperature is 160 degrees. That's kind of the highest level you ever want to see your compost because, um, and we know that one of the benefits of compost to high temperatures is that it will kill out certain pathogens. It will kill out weed seeds. It's not going to be 100% efficient, but if you get that above 160 degrees, yeah, you're going to kill out those things, but you're also going to kill out a lot of the beneficial organisms that you would hope would remain in that compost for when you add it as a soil amendment. So 160 degrees is about the highest level you want to get because at that point, that compost starts to lose a lot of its good benefits. So how do you keep oxygen in that compost pile? And here you see a picture of a commercial composting operation where they're using a compost turner. And when they first blend those materials together, they may go out for the first couple of weeks every other day and turn that material. Now, I don't think a backyard composter is going to do that. And I always get the question, well, how often should I turn? And for backyard composters, I will say as often as your back will let you. So if you can go out and say even once a month, that's better than not doing it at all. If you could do it every 2 weeks, that's better. I've seen a lot of good results with those turning barrels because you can go out and you can turn that barrel and you're adding oxygen into it every time you turn it. And I've seen and I've heard a lot of cases where people are very pleased with that. So those turning barrels seem to work fairly well. You also want to make sure that that pile is not super wet. If it's super wet, all the water has taken up those air spaces, and so it can go anaerobic then as well. And if you have a situation where it's too wet, you may need to add some coarse materials, things like wood chips, something like that, that would provide some more air pockets. And that's especially true if you're not going to be turning that compost very often. If you really want to monitor the temperature, you see a picture here of a temperature probe. And this is something that you can buy online. It's just a dial thermometer with about a 3 or 4 foot probe in it. And this was out behind our office. I'm not trying to measure the temperature of the gravel that's out there. I'm just using that for a placeholder. But what you're looking for in terms of your composting is temperatures somewhere around 90 to 160 degrees. You'll be surprised when you put that compost together, especially in early summer, how quickly the temperature will go up on it. Now, if you're below 90 and it remains that way, you've got something that's limiting that composting. Something is not allowing that bacteria to thrive and function well. You can go to the other extreme too. If you've got a lot of really fast decomposing materials in there and it's got a lot of oxygen, it may get above 160. Now, that doesn't typically happen very often with backyard composting operations, but it can happen. And again, if we get it above 160, we're starting to reduce the number of aerobic bacteria in there and other potential beneficial microorganisms. We're essentially sterilizing that compost. And so we're losing that disease suppression capabilities and we're turning it into a product that's really not very good. I don't think you're ever going to have this problem. I know some people have said that their compost has smoked. In a lot of cases, what they may have seen coming off of it was steam or condensed water vapor. But in larger compost piles, they can actually catch fire. And you can see the folks putting water on this compost pile here in the background. And this was a study that was done by University of Minnesota Extension. They showed that when that moisture content's between 26 and 46%, and the temperature gets above 100, 200 degrees, it will light up. Uh, and this happens when you don't have a lot of airflow through there, and that compost, you do have to have a pretty good amount of compost there. In this case, they were talking about piles over 7 feet high. If you've got enough material that you've got a compost pile over 7 feet high, uh, you might want to break it down into two smaller piles. If you're going to use that compost thermometer, that's the position that you typically want it to have. You don't want it down at the very bottom of that compost pile, but you want it about 3/4 of the way down, about a foot off the bottom, and stuck into the center. And that will give you a good reading. Now, if you don't want to go out and you don't want to pay for a compost thermometer, and you still want to have an idea of whether that compost is firing up, you can get a piece of concrete rebar, metal stake, or something like that. Stick that into the compost pile, come back 24 hours later, and then at first gingerly, but touch the outside end of that bar. If you feel some warmth to that bar, or maybe quite a bit of warmth to that bar, you know that there's something going on in that compost pile. Obviously not going to give you an exact reading, but it'll at least give you a guideline of whether something's going on or not. Particle size comes into play. That can affect how fast the material will decompose and how easily air will flow through it. The smaller that material is, the more surface area there is for that microbes, those aerobic bacteria, to work on it. On the other hand, if you have a lot of really small material there, that's really going to cut down on the air space, the air movement through there. So you kind of have to work on a happy medium with this. And we usually recommend 1/8 inch to 1/2 inch particle size for this. For moisture, and ideally you're looking for something around 40 to 60%. Again, I don't think people are going to go out, and you can figure that out if you want to go through and do a process where you take the material and put it in your microwave. We have done that sometimes when we've run some commercial composting clinics, and usually the people are not too happy with their uh, microwaves after that's been done. In fact, in one cases, we had to go out and buy a new microwave for the folks because it just, I don't think they were going to put their lunch in that anymore. So anyway, what a good guideline for this is, if you pick up a handful of it and it feels slightly damp, you're right where you need to be. If you wring any water out of it, that is way too wet. And I know in a lot of cases, most people are not going to take the time to put covers over their compost, but just realize if it gets really wet, you're shutting down that compost process. And the more you shut down that process, the less quality you're going to have with that finished product. And too wet, it'll go anaerobic. If it's too dry, you're not going to have the microbes in there. So if you have a very dry summer, you may have to go out and add some water to that compost to keep things going. It also kind of depends on what type of materials are out there. This was a study that was done from University of California, where they found that things like straw, even at high moisture contents, 85 to 90%, could still be aerobic and could still be composting. But other material, for example, things that have a lot of paper in them, became anaerobic when the moisture was around 70%. So that material comes into play as well. This is another question we get a lot of times. How long does it take for compost? And I've had a lot of people say that they've had compost in 6 weeks. And I can guarantee you, you did not have a finished compost in 6 weeks, especially for a backyard composting operation. Even under ideal conditions, commercial composters, the best they can hope for is a minimum of 2 months. And even at that, they're going to have to let it sit and cure for several weeks after that. For most backyard operations, you're looking at a minimum of 6 months, and that's doing everything like you should. On other hands, and this is not to say that there's anything wrong with this, because if you get the product that you like, then that's fine. But just know that if you're really wanting a finished stable compost, you're probably looking at a half a year to several years to get to that point. And when you look at it and you think it's done, do you really know it's done? Probably in a lot of cases, it's not totally done. And what you can have problems with if it's not completely done, and say you take that, put that into the soil, and then you plant into it. You may find out that your seeds don't grow, your plants don't do well, because an unfinished compost may still have a lot of ammonia in it and other things that will not allow that plant to thrive. The other thing that can happen is if it's not truly finished, those aerobic bacteria are still going to try to break that material down. And if they do that, they're going to pull nitrogen out of the soil to finish that process. And your plants may look a sickly yellow because they're exhibiting a nitrogen deficiency. So what you do is when you get that compost looking like it's pretty well done, then you just need to let it set for several weeks or maybe several months. Don't use it right away. You want to let that compost cure or really stabilize before you get to the point where you use it, especially if you're going to use it as a soil amendment and then plant into it right away. The other thing that happens during the curing process is that's when the temperatures are no longer going up, and that's the point where other organisms can start coming in and kind of continue that decomposition process on that harder to decompose forms of carbon. So that's when your fungi will come in, that's when your actinomycete populations will come in. So how do you know if it's a finely finished product? Well, there's a couple of different ways. If you want to really test, there's something called the Solvida test. And what that does is it measures the amount of carbon dioxide in it and also measures the amount of ammonia. And it's just basically a color test. You take some material, you put it into this Solvita container, and then you wait a little while, and then you look at the colors when they're done, and it will indicate whether there's a high amount of ammonia or a high amount of carbon dioxide, or maybe both. Another thing that's very easy, very cheap to do is just do some germination tests. Get about 9 styrofoam cups, put some good garden soil in, or put in 3 of them your good garden soil. Another 3, do about half of your compost, half of the garden soil, and another 3, all of your all just compost. And then put something that germinates very easily, like radishes or something like that in there. Make sure you've marked which one of those containers contain what material, and then wait and see what happens. If you notice that in that half and half mix or in the compost mix, those things don't germinate well, that's pretty much a giveaway that that compost is not mature yet. Finished compost, you should not be able to tell what any of that original material was. It should just look like good earth. It should have a dark color. It should have that good earthy smell, which is kind of coming from those actinomycetes, and it'll be crumbly. You should not be able to tell what the material was. Years ago, I had a container of material that I would pass around when we would do this for our master gardener classes. Pass it around, and it had that good earthy smell to it. You couldn't tell what it was. And after everybody had checked it out, I will let people know that the original materials had been pick, poop, and yard material, but it had been very well composted, and you could not tell what any of that material was. You did not smell any of the odors you would have smelled from those original materials. It was just good finished compost. We have lots of different things that we can talk about in terms of uses of compost. Some people, and all of these are great. Some people just use it as a mulch where they just put it on top of the ground. Again, it's a very stable form of organic material. It shouldn't decompose very rapidly, especially on the ground. And really, the only interaction there is going to be between the soil and that bottom layer of the compost. So you'll get a little bit of interaction there. A lot of it's not going to work directly into the soil, but that's okay. A lot of folks use it as a soil amendment. If you want to raise your organic matter content, good finished compost is an excellent way of doing that. Just know that if you add that in there, if you work that into the soil, it's not a one and done thing. If you want to maintain those higher organic matter levels, you're going to have to continue to add compost to it, if not yearly, at least every other year. Because what will happen is every time you work that soil and adding oxygen into it, those aerobic bacteria are going to decompose that organic material at a higher rate. And so it may start out very high, but then quickly over time, the more you work the soil, that organic matter level is going to go back down. So it's something that you continually have to add. And basically what you're doing is you're artificially raising the organic matter level of that soil. Works great in potting mixes if you have a good finished type of material. And then how many folks of you out there use compost tea? I heard it's really tasty. Actually, it's people use it in a lot of cases, and there's a lot of research out there that shows that it does have some disease suppression characteristics for different types of mixes. So works well in those cases too. All right. So to talk about the do's, we said we were talking about do's and don'ts. Here's some of the do's that you want to try to shoot for when you're composting. You want to try to have that carbon nitrogen ratio around 20 to 40 to 1. Now, I didn't talk about this, but I'll talk. I didn't have a slide for this, but I'll just talk about this really fast. A general way to get a good blend of something like that to be in that general range, take about 6 to 8 inches of brown material. Start off with that, whether you've got brown leaves or straw or whatever, about 6 to 8 inches of that. On top of that, put a couple of inches of the high nitrogen material, things like your fruit scraps, vegetable scraps, manure, tea grounds, coffee grounds. Don't worry about the paper filters, throw them in there too, they'll decompose. Don't worry about the tea bags or the strings or anything, they'll decompose. Just throw all of that in there. And, and then on top of that, put about an inch or two of either already finished compost or your garden soil. That's going to provide your bacteria. Keep alternating those layers until you get up. We typically want you to have at least about a cubic yard as a minimum to get good composting going. So that's a good way of blending materials together. For the moisture content, again, if you pick up a handful of it and it feels slightly damp, you're right about where it needs to be. For oxygen concentration, if you're not getting any bad smells off of it, you're probably okay. And that's typically if that oxygen gets below 5% in the compost, you're going to start noticing because it's going to go anaerobic and you're going to start getting those smells off of it. Particle size about 1/8 to 1/2 inch, and that ideal temperature range around 110 to 150. And when you first mix those materials together, especially in summertime, it'll go up very rapidly. Within 24 hours, it'll probably easily be in the 120 to 130 range. Days it'll start going back down, and that's kind of telling you you're beginning to run out of oxygen in that compost. If you're using temperature as a guideline, you can use that as a guideline for telling you when to compost or when to turn. I mean, once it gets down to about 110 or below, I'd turn it again. That would be a good way to know if you're wanting to use that as a guideline on when to turn. Things that you do not want to do with your compost. Don't let your compost go anaerobic, because the first time you do that and anytime you do that, you're lowering the quality of that compost. And some people get really technical on what they consider compost to be. I work with one person that will say that if you're just putting a pile out there and it's static, what you end up with is not compost. It's just rotted material. I'm not quite that militant about it, but just know there's a wide range of out there and what your end product can be. You do not want to add oils, fats, greases, or bones, or dog or cat waste. Any of those things will either make it go anaerobic or you're introducing pathogens in there. Don't let your compost get overly wet or too dry. And that might be a little bit difficult to do, especially if you have a rainy season. If you do have a way to compost or to cover that compost and manage that moisture on your own, that's great. If not, then just try to have some dry materials that you can blend into it. And then the other thing is uh, always make sure you do not add material that has been sprayed with any type of herbicide or insecticide or anything, even if it's been several months since that's happened. Usually, especially with herbicides, they degrade very quickly in the summertime, but we always tell people to err on the side of safety. One of the questions I've gotten here in the last few weeks is talking about composting pumpkins. Pumpkins can be composted, but my first suggestion was pull as many of those seeds out as possible, because unless you have much temperature in that compost, and even though that temperature will kill out a lot of the seeds, it's not going to kill out 100% of them. And so, unless you want a really great pumpkin patch next spring in your compost pile, pull out those seeds as much as possible. And that's true for any type of material that has seeds. Do not put in weeds that have seed heads on them. If they're then you can put them on the compost pile. That's a great nitrogen source, but don't add seeds into it. And I told you we would have plenty of time for questions. So next month, Miss Peggy Doty is going to be talking to you about vermicomposting. She's the queen of worms. And, and she will talk to you about uh, the technique to use for vermicomposting. works really great if you get, for example, a daily newspaper, which not many people do that anymore, but if you do, it's great. And if you have a lot of vegetable scraps. But she'll talk about all the things that work well for that. So with that, I am done. And if there are questions out there, I'll be happy to take them.
We do. We have some, and then I will recheck the chat here. I've been moving them over to a Word document just to make it easier. Um, let's see. So back near the beginning, Carmen was asking if flavored coffee grounds are harmful at all to the compost.
No,
Okay.
I've never seen anything that says that there's a problem with that. And typically in most of these situations, what you're adding are really, really small amounts of these things. I mean, they're not going to be overpowering. One of the questions we get sometimes is about eggshells. And I say, unless you're running a chicken hatchery, your eggshells will be fine. Just crumble them up and they'll take longer to decompose, but that's fine in a compost pile.
Sure. Okay. Nice. Um, Deborah asked, "Is dried blood the same as blood meal?"
That's a good question. It's going to be very close. Blood meal may have a slightly different carbon nitrogen ratio.
Mhm.
I'm guessing it's going to be a little bit higher on the carbon nitrogen ratio. Um, and honestly, I don't see dried blood in your local hardware store
Right.
unless I'm not looking in the right spot. So um,
You have to go to the vampire section.
that's right. Well, it is coming up on Halloween, so
Right.
you might look for that in your trick or treat bag.
Andrew and I both want you to define legume hay, please.
Okay, so anything like clover hay, alfalfa hay, it's typically going to still be green.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Hay, what I would consider hay or straw hay. I mean, um, well, clover, alfalfa, I guess it's all can be called hay, but straw. So like wheat stubble, rice stubble, anything that's already brown before it's baled
Mm-hmm.
is going to be straw. Going to be very high carbon content because it's already lost all its nitrogen. If it's not green, pretty much consider it to be a high carbon source and a low nitrogen source.
Okay.
One
Let's.
thing I'll mention here real quick too, and I don't know if this question comes up. I get the question a lot of times about walnut leaves, um, and because of the juglone that's in the walnut trees. A couple of things with that. First of all, um, when do when do you usually see walnut leaves lose or start falling off? Usually it's in late August, early September. They're small leaves. They decompose pretty rapidly. I have never in my life heard of anyone raking up walnut leaves to put in their compost. But the other thing is, as that compost is working, that juglone is degrading, and probably by the time you're done, there is no juglone left in that material. So you really don't have to worry about it. But again, I have not seen that. You don't want to put the walnuts in there um,
Right.
because
Never go away.
yeah, they'll never go away. But other than that, if you had a small amount of those walnut leaves to put in there, you should be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And with oak leaves, yeah, they decompose a little bit longer, but they're still fine for composting. You may just need to add some more high nitrogen material to help them along.
Huh. Alrighty then. Mary did what I asked and gave me a reference. Thank you, Mary. Regarding particle size of material being put into the compost pile, she said I should stop throwing my whole pumpkins into the pile. They seem to get soft pretty quickly. It was right when we were talking about pumpkins. So minus the seeds, can she do that? Just put it in since it softens so fast?
Yeah, in most cases it should be okay. I was going to say since it decomposes pretty rapidly on its own, and probably if it's already getting mushy by the time you throw it in there, when you throw it, it's going to fall apart too. So, if you want to beat on it a little bit and kind of open it up a little bit, that might help things along. But
And the
you don't absolutely have to. The other thing, though, to remember with pumpkins is they're a very high moisture content material. So if you're adding that, just be sure you have a lot of dry material to go along with it, because otherwise you're going to end up with a very mushy compost, and it can still go anaerobic because you got a lot of moisture there.
sure. Paul asked, in his barrel composter, the mainly fresh grass clippings turn into baseball sized clods. Don't
Yeah,
have ground material in the spring, summer. Any suggestions?
I've heard of that before, and I'll be honest, I've had usually the person that's worked with me talk about that, And the solution for that, and off the top of my head, I cannot remember what it is, but there is a solution out there.
Lay it out, like rake it, but flip it a few days in a row, like dry it out a little better.
Well, you end up, yeah, with the, and it's one of those things too where commercial composters, they'll end up with these essentially clay balls
Oh wow.
in their, even in their trenches, in their piles. So, and in some cases, you may just have to remove those, and whether you can break them up and then try to recompost them. I think that's part of the solution. Uh, what you can do is either email me or Peggy, and I will find the answer for that and get it back to you.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, I have a rolling composter. Since I am adding material a lot, I have some material that looks fine and then also a lot of not decomposed materials. How do I handle this?
Okay, and that's a really good question too. Um, what you can do is, if you're getting some of that good finished product, and this is probably what you already do, I would go ahead and pull that stuff out. The one thing to think about with that, hopefully you're not adding any manures in those situations, because when you add that fresh material in there, or that fresh manure, and you got to think about this too, if you are using manure and you go to turn that material, first thing you should do is turn your older compost first, and then go to your fresh. Say if you've got several piles of compost, make sure your pitchfork or whatever you're using is clean. Turn that first and go to your old or your younger piles afterwards, because your fresher ones are going to have more pathogens in them. So if you do it the other way around, what you're essentially doing is you're inoculating those older piles that may be relatively pathogen free with new pathogens. Now, this is only if you're using manure or something like that. If you're not, it's not quite as much of a problem.
Huh. Next one. Does finished compost have clumps the size of ping pong balls?
They can. Yep. If there's they can do that in some cases. And again, just kind of take those out if you can break them up and see if they will go into the next compost pile. That's about and again, that's not an uncommon problem. Like I say, even in commercial operations, they will get those things.
Mm-hmm. What about adding shrimp and lobster shells?
Unless you want to have the neighborhood raccoons come in for a feast,
Yeah,
I would not add them.
I would say that would definitely draw a raccoon or a skunk. Um,
Heck, I might even come by and look at it.
just in case. What do you do with anaerobic compost?
uh, well, what you can do, if it's just gone anaerobic, if you have fresh material, if you can mix something in there to get the air back into it, it will go ahead and go through compost. Just realize, and in a lot of cases, it's not going to be the end of the world. Just know that the more times it goes anaerobic,
Mm.
the less high quality that compost is going to be.
Mm.
Now, if someone wanted to go out and spend the money to send in a sample and get those readings, I don't think most backyard composters are going to do that. And most backyard composters are not going to be concerned really about, whether it's super high quality compost, or, it looks like compost, may not be the best quality, but if it still will work. In most cases, again, it's still going to work. Nature's not going to go out and say, nope, this is only 90% of the highest quality, and I'm not going to allow it in my soil. So, just know that the more it goes anaerobic, the less good it's going to be. But you can try to get it finished. Just go out and add some dry material to it, fluff it up, and see if it'll go back and do some composting. And it may come into a fairly good product by the time you get through with it.
Hmm. Interesting. Oh, Cindy wanted a reminder of what was the ratio of carbon in paper?
Around 200 to 1. And again, that's just a general guideline, but gives you an idea. Very high carbon source.
And let's see, can you have too much coffee grounds?
Somebody's going to have to drink a lot of coffee. My wife drinks a lot of coffee, but even her amount of coffee drinking would not be enough to really change anything. It's a very high nitrogen source, and it's going to have a lot of water in it. So I guess if you were running a neighborhood coffee time or something like that, and you had bunches of coffee grounds and those kind of things every day, and just a small amount of carbon material, it may pose a problem. But again, I really can't see even a one a day type of thing posing a big deal. Just realize again, you're adding quite a bit of moisture into it, but those one a day things, even at that, I don't think that would add much moisture to the point where it would make it anaerobic. But really
Right.
high, good nitrogen source.
So here's one I'm interested in. Nancy asked, is shredded computer paper, mail, and envelopes okay to use as the carbon?
Um, I would say in majority of cases, yes. If it's a carbon-based material or cotton-based material, um, then it should be fine. Or if it's a paper like from pulpwood or something like that, if it's shiny, if it's got shiny color on it, I would stay away from it because then it's got manufactured inks and those kind of things. But and one thing you can do too is, some of these materials, if you're not really sure about it, do a little experiment. Take a small piece of it, shove it in your compost pile, and go out and take a look at it a month later. If it looks like it's decomposing, then
Yeah,
you're good to go.
I tried that with my compost outside. I use towels and rags till they're absolutely rotten, and I had this small like hand towel. It was all just it's cotton, and it's just
Hmm.
you can put your finger through it. I just laid it over some of the greens, and then just kept working. And later I was picking for it. I couldn't find it.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
gone.
It's nature's a wonderful thing. It'll take care of most things.
Let's see. We have just a couple of minutes, and I want to get to these. Can you use compost tea in a vegetable patch, and how long can you preserve the tea? Another person had forgotten she had it. Like, do you need to dilute it? Will it even be good after a while?
That's another question I'm not going to be able to answer exactly, and I think it kind of depends too on the material that it was extracted from. It's one of those things where probably smell would be a little bit of an indicator. If it doesn't smell very good, then I wouldn't use it. Um, on for the compost tea, if the one thing that I would say with that in particular, if it's I would definitely not use any compost tea on vegetables where you have manures in the compost. If it was just plain yard materials, vegetable scraps, it should be okay. But I wouldn't use any manure-based compost tea on anything like that.
Somebody did ask to define the compost tea. I should probably throw that in with this.
It's basically just a liquid extract from the compost material, where I think in most cases people will. Sometimes there is some liquid at the bottom, or sometimes they'll take a small amount of compost and then actually pour water through it and get the extract from it.
Mhm. Um, should you add small stems from end of the season perennials
Um,
clippings?
yeah, it'll take longer to compost, especially if they're already desiccated. I would cut them up as much as possible. Again, you don't want to add anything that has any seeds still associated with it, but the stems, cut them up as much as possible and let them go. It may take them a while to decompose, but they will eventually.
Can you repeat the question before you answer? If I
Oh,
turn it up to hear the question, when you answer, you're shouting.
Oh,
And I'm
okay.
constantly turning up and down and up and down. Can you repeat the question, please, before you answer?
Okay.
so there are a couple people, so I'm going to condense this question. What do you do if you see any kind of mold in any compost or composter,
Okay. What do you do if you see any type of mold?
like fuzzy stuff?
Yeah, that's just some things that may be telling you that that compost does have quite a bit of moisture with it. If it's not black mold or something like that, in most cases, it's just going to be types of fungi that may be working. That's probably also telling you that compost hasn't gotten to a very high temperature.
Hmm.
So, that would be one of the things I would check. If you're finding that in there, that's because obviously the temperatures are not high enough to kill it out.
Okay.
So I would just clean out the barrel or whatever you have, and I wouldn't throw away the compost, but I would maybe just clean that out and go on from there and figure out what's going on where you're not getting very high temperatures.
Interesting. Next question. Are you, um, or should we be concerned about manure on vegetables as a compost?
Question, should we be concerned about vegetables or manures, composted manure on vegetables? We always say to err on the side of safety. And that's kind of what I was talking about with the tea extract.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that heat process, that compost is going to kill out a lot of pathogens, but it's not going to get 100% of it. So anytime you have any type of compost, I would not add it directly onto any type of. You could add it as if you're going to plant into it. And I would probably still stay away from root veg. So think about think about erring on the side of safety whenever you're using that material.
Nice. Okay. Um, Folks, there are so many more questions that I'm not going to be able to ask Dwayne today. I apologize. Hopefully, you've got something from this. I'm not going to admit how I compost, at least not why Dwayne's on here. But I would tell you in a personal email because he's not going to be happy. But um, just so you know, if you missed anything, this has been recorded and it will come to you later. Dwayne, does that email come from you with the recording? It'll either be Dwayne Friend or U of I.
Yeah, it may be
So
U of I.
it may take a while. They need to close caption them first. And as I said in the beginning, it may take a little bit of time. So please be patient with that. And we want to thank you for being here today for this hour. And if anyone's interested in worm composting, I am not the compost extraordinaire like Dwayne, but I do compost with worms at home. So mine will be more about what has worked and where it's failed. So you're welcome to join me next week for that. Dwayne, I always learn more and correct myself on my presentations when I listen to yours. So I thank you. And
Well, you're welcome. And the one thing I do want to end up with is, I don't want to make it sound like if you don't do everything perfectly, you're not going to end up with compost. Again, nature is a wonderful thing. If you get what you're happy with at the end, then everything is good.
Yeah, compost happens, right?
That's right.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for joining us. And we hope to have you on other programs in the future.
Thank you for tuning into CUI's TV. We hope you enjoyed the show. This video can be accessed anytime on youtube.com. In the YouTube search bar, type in UPTV6 and look for their microphone logo. We hope you will join us again next week for more local, engaging content designed specifically for Champaign County older adults. Take care and stay safe.